All right, all welcome back to Rebooting the Blue. We've got Steve Bradley this month, and we are looking at how to bulletproof your brain, outsmart thinking distortions. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. We're not medical doctors. This isn't medical advice. This is just information, education for you to chew on and hopefully dive into. We'll share some resources if you want to dive deeper after the session. But just kind of, let's put it out there. There's a lot in life that we can't control, which is super frustrating. But I think that we don't often realize we have a bit more control over our experience, in any given situation than we really think about or even realize. But before we dive deeper into that, Steve, can you help us understand what thoughts are, right? Like voluntary versus involuntary. What's going on there in the brain?
Well, what's going on there in the brain is thoughts are a combination of things that we intentionally focus on and thoughts that just happen to be there. I just had a conversation with a patient today who noticed that she had thoughts and believed that they were true. And I said, "How do you know they're true?" She goes, "Well, I don't." So what I encourage her to do is just notice the thoughts. They may be true, they may not be true, they may be partially true, they may be partially false. Just notice them as if they're an object rather than embracing them. The hard part is we have our conscious thoughts that we're fully aware of, but we also have those thoughts in the back of our brain that are running that we don't always pay attention to, but sometimes we notice, and those could be just as risky.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's this whole like, now we're not just thinking, we're thinking about thinking is what we're
We're
going to
thinking
talk about,
about thinking.
right? We're going to talk about today. And I love this. Like there's voluntary, there's involuntary, right? But we don't have to attach to any of them. And I know that's huge for me, right? And that's kind of how I think about what you're describing to your client, right? Like just because the thought pops up, number one doesn't mean that we volunteered it. And number two doesn't mean we have to like let it run away with us. So it's just that noticing aspect. And I know you're going to help us understand that better when we dive deeper into the ABC model of thinking. So I know you've got a couple slides here. Do you want me to share that one while you just give us a brief overview?
So as you're pulling up the slides, a brief overview of what's called thinking distortions. Oftentimes you'll hear them described as automatic negative thoughts. You may have them described as distorted thoughts, unhealthy thinking styles. There's several different variations of how they're described, but effectively all of these come out of, or not all of them, but many of them come out of philosophy and logic. You will find some of this stuff in Stoic philosophy, which is of value, particularly with law enforcement or people that are often worried about how they're thinking. Uh, so, as you've noticed with the ABCDs, something will happen, and there'll be some kind of a triggering event. And the problem with the trigger event is we have a thought about it. Okay. If we just notice that that's the thought that we're having, and we just think consciously, is this true? Is this not true? Okay, we're going to do better. But if we believe it to be true and it's not true, that's where we get an emotional consequence or behavioral consequence that gets us in trouble. All right. All that said, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So I love that this is honestly one of my biggest personal go-to tools like in the world that I don't always remember to tap into. But I always think about the activating event. The easiest way for me to understand that is that's like what a video camera would catch, right? Or like a phone, since no one has video cameras anymore, right? Like what would get recorded objectively as to what went down. And then we're gonna have beliefs that automatically pop up associated with that just based on our past experiences and values and all these different things and negativity bias or whatever's going on. And that happens like automatically. We don't necessarily volunteer them, right? Like you talked about thoughts, voluntary, involuntary. And a lot of times we just go through life without even recognizing that the belief popped up. And so we usually jump from A to C, right? Activating event and the consequences. And consequences can be comfortable or uncomfortable, right? Like it's just the outcome.
Right.
And so the control, the power that we have is in thinking about thinking, right? Like checking that belief that pops up. Can we identify what it was? Do I agree with it? Is it true objectively? So I absolutely love this tool. So now the belief part, I know, dives us into those common thinking distortions. So I'll pop over to that slide you've got here for that. If you want to just kind of like walk us through what are some common thinking distortions?
So these are, uh, any of the lists are going to have basically these same 10. Okay. And so I'm going to briefly go through each one to kind of explain it a little bit. But we have all or nothing thinking, sometimes called black and white thinking. This is where people think in the extreme. If you hear words used like, I'm always this way, or I'm never that way, or everyone does this, or no one does that, now you're starting to move into that all or nothing thinking. The
Mm-hmm.
problem is our brain interprets it literally, even though we don't mean it literally.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
all or nothing thinking, that makes me think of like fixed mindset versus growth mindset, right? And we know when we're stuck in that fixed mindset,
mhm.
that's really, really hard to learn, to develop, to grow as a person, because it's not safe to be wrong, or possible to be wrong, or possible to be successful within failure. And so it's that kind of like shifting to that hopefully growth mindset where it's even like, look at the process that we went through and did we learn, and those sorts of things.
And the example on the screen for all or nothing, these can be very subtle, which makes them particularly dangerous. But I want to go with the one example there. If I'm not perfect, I've failed.
Mm-hmm.
And we may not use that exact language, but we might say, oh, I screwed up that call for service. And it might actually be, yeah, there's some parts of it that I screwed up, but there are other parts I did well. And overall, it might not have worked well, but that doesn't mean I screwed it up.
Mm-hmm.
So
Or that
sometimes,
completely.
mhm. The next one to the right, overgeneralizing, seeing a pattern based upon a single event or being overly broad in conclusions that we draw. People are overly broad in conclusions quite regularly,
Mm-hmm.
or we overgeneralize things. You know, one of my coworkers decided that he was going to avoid that call. We might overgeneralize and say, well, they always avoid calls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that might be not be true. They may have just done it in that one moment, and we in our brain start thinking, oh, well, they always do that. Well, maybe
Mm-hmm.
they don't. But that gets us into a trouble because now we start thinking negative thoughts about that person. There's a thought consequence, and then we might have an emotional consequence, and may have only happened once,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or maybe just a small percentage of time.
Yeah. So question here, is that kind of like a place where negativity bias can start to pop up more and more if we're overgeneralizing to the negative and then building those thought patterns that are just highlighting for us the negative?
Yes.
Okay.
It can start there, but that filtering process may also be based on other biases
Mm-hmm.
that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which,
I know that's a trigger word for people, but
yeah, I was gonna say, just to plug, like all humans have bias, and
mhm.
having bias does not make you a bad person at all. It's not a value judgment. But
but but
our
when we overgeneralize,
yeah, yeah.
our bias is coming out.
Yes. And when our biases are not accurately informing us or helping us to really act in ways that are true to like what's happening around us, they can harm us and others. And so just being aware of what our biases are, give us more control over them. And they're rooted in like some super basic, human survival stuff. So we understand why they happen, but we just have to, you know, build awareness for the fact that they exist and how they impact us so they don't run us. We can manage them.
Mhm. So moving on to mental filter, um, paying only attention to certain details or types of evidence. Um, Officers usually are pretty good about having to see the entire scene and trying to take in all considerations. So they do a great job of that. But in our personal life, sometimes we might have these filters where we filter out positives and only focus on the negative. A
Mhm.
professor of mine in college would call it an arbitrary focus of the negative. We're filtering out the positives.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes it goes the other direction where we filter out the negatives and we get overly optimistic of something and we miss the negative signs that say, okay, maybe this isn't as great and wonderful as we think. What I like about rational motive therapy that comes to this is thinking, let's think rationally about it. Let's look at both the pros and the cons that are involved.
Mhm.
That way we see it not through some filter, but we see it reality.
Mhm.
The next one, disqualifying the positive. Um, Kind of related to mental filter, but discounting the good things that have happened or that you have done for some reason or another. Sometimes called minimizing.
Okay.
This one can also be quite subtle, but it can also be quite bold. Oh, what I did was not a big deal. We might minimize something that we did as, oh, it's not a big deal. Or we might, that's disqualifying the positive. We do something good, oh, it's really not that big a deal. Or we might do the opposite. We might maximize a negative bigger than it really is. How many times have you gone on a vacation that didn't go well and you say, oh, my vacation sucked? When, okay, the transportation probably wasn't good, some of the food wasn't good, but did the whole thing, was it all negative?
Yeah. Probably not. Hopefully not.
Yeah. So that one's sometimes called minimizing the positive and maximizing the negative.
Okay.
Thank you for the next slide. Jumping to conclusions. This one's my favorite, partly because I tend to do this one and I have to be careful. It's when and there's two flavors of this, or two types. One is mind reading, where we assume we know the intentions, motives, or thoughts of another person.
Okay.
And then when we act on it as if it were true, then we can kind of get into trouble. Sometimes it's called assuming, and when you assume, you make an ass out of yourself and sometimes the other person. The other one is fortune telling, trying to predict the future. Oh, I know this person, this is the way it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to predict the future. And we get all set up like it's going to happen exactly this way. Well, it might not happen that way at all, or it might happen that way, but not be as bad as we predict. And human beings overall are really bad at predicting. Some people like to think they're really good at it, but if you genuinely look at all of your predictions, you'll find that you're not nearly as good as you think you are. Oh, I'll confess, I'm not nearly as good as I think I am.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm good at fortune telling or not. My brain really likes to catastrophize. So I'm like looking at that next one, just being like, that is my go-to. I am so good at that. Like top-notch catastrophizer. In fact, I literally like have a tattoo to remind me to not catastrophize.
Well, that's a good point to just take a segue to, of all of these thinking errors, this is one of the few times I will say this, everybody does these things. Yes. I will use an all or nothing thinking error to say, everybody does this.
Yeah.
Okay. And most people do more than one, if not everybody does more than one. So if somebody is listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, I do so many of these, I'm a bad person, you're a good company, because so many of us do more than one of these, and everybody does some of them.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why they're called 10 common thinking distortions, right? Like,
right. So I kind of alluded to it previously with the magnification, catastrophizing, minimizing, blowing things out of proportion, that catastrophizing, overreacting. If you have anybody in your life that has a borderline personality disorder, this is one of those key symptoms that crop up. They tend to catastrophize and blow things out of proportion. Not helpful.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I don't have borderline personality disorder. There's nothing wrong if you do. My catastrophizing, and I'm interested if this like resonates with a lot of people. I find that my brain just does it on its own, right? And I'm guessing this happens for a lot of folks in law enforcement. Is it just like something happens, something small, right? Like that input, and then your brain is thinking of all the different ways that it could go wrong, how you're going to respond, how you can prevent the bad thing from happening, whether it's personal life or work life or something else, right? It doesn't have to be like on a call, although you're probably thinking through those options on a call as well. But it's that brain like attaches to that thing and then just goes for, how do we plan for, counteract, predict all of the possible things that we might have to manage in association with this, so we end up with a positive outcome, right?
And it's a great observation that sometimes this is trained into officers. Now, it's meant to keep people safe, which is a benefit, but it also potentially has a downside.
And it feeds through that natural stress response, right? Because what the brain is doing is it's going to focus on the threat, and it's going to try to make sure that it survives the threat. And that might you know, be coming up with a few different ways to make sure that you come out on top. So that's not a bad thing. It's just paying attention to when like this is happening in your brain, you didn't volunteer it, it's not beneficial, you don't necessarily want to attach to it, and it's not helping you in some way.
Correct. So I'm going to move on to emotional reasoning. That's when we use our emotions to assuming that because we feel a certain way, it must be true.
Mm-hmm.
A great one is, I feel like I screwed up. I feel guilty.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I did something bad. Our emotions alert that something's not right, but it doesn't mean that our emotions are accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Just like thoughts can be true or false. Emotions can be accurate or inaccurate or somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of emotional reasoning. If some event happens and like I said, I feel guilty that it happened if somehow it's my fault. We
Mm-hmm.
might be personalizing, which kind of bridges into the emotional reasoning. Part of the reason I say that is some of these actually interact with each other, and you may be doing a couple of them at the same time
Yeah.
or in the same episode,
Yeah.
and it compounds problems.
Oh yeah, they're just having a little party up there in that brain.
Yep.
Love
And
it.
not a good party. It's the one
I
you want
know,
to
right?
the party you wish would shut down.
Yeah.
The shoulds and the muffs. I love this one because you see it all over the place. You see it on the news. You see all these on the news. You see them in politics. Doesn't matter which political spectrum, where on the political spectrum somebody lands.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not always sound like should or must. It may just be the notion of I have to do something, or I must do something, or should do something. They're critical words that can make us feel guilty or judged or a failure. And many times the demands that are being made are not even defined.
Mm.
Good example. Somebody who says, I should be a better dad. One, what does a good dad look like is not defined.
Mm-hmm.
Two, it's demanding, and it's also implying that I'm failing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect.
Um, we will get more into it later of the disputing, but for this one, a good way to do it is you have to reword that sentence. Instead of saying, I should be a better dad, maybe try something like, I would like to be a better dad,
I like
or
that.
I can be a better mom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just because you can improve at something doesn't mean that you're bad at it right now.
And it doesn't mean you're a failure, and it doesn't mean it's a fixed mindset that you can't learn.
Yeah.
Going back to that growth mindset, there's so many things that we can grow and get better at, and the shoulds and musts often imply we can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So our next slide, labeling. We do this all the time, and it's not helpful. Okay, let me backtrack. We do it a lot. We may not do it all the time, but we do it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We do it to ourselves. We do it to other
Mm-hmm.
people.
Mm-hmm.
People do it to us, and people do it to themselves. I'm a loser. I'm a failure. I'm an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm broken. I'm damaged. All of these labels that we throw on it. And the problem is, one, it might be describing just one aspect of us, but the label assumes existentially, or that is what the person is as a whole, and may assume the whole person is an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I've made idiotic decisions, but that doesn't make me an idiot.
Yeah.
I've lost, but that doesn't make me a loser.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if you, so for me, like the way I've tried to work around like not labeling, right? Because it's also, I think we're not saying you can't say that you screwed up, or you can't say you didn't make a like shitty decision or something, right? Like we all do that. So like none of us are perfect. So instead of me saying like, well, I'm an ass, I'll say like, wow, that was an asshole thing to do. Or if I did something that like I can own that the action that I did was like kind of a dick move.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't, I'm not taking on the label that is me as a person, right? Like that was one thing that I did at one moment in time. And
I'm
so
gonna I'm going to give one more example, but this is in the medical field. When somebody has cancer, we don't say they're cancer.
Yeah.
We say they have cancer. That's what I mean by this with the labeling is we may do that, but that doesn't mean who we are. So it's a difference between what I do versus who I am. And it's very subtle. It may be in the back of our mind. We may be in that back of our mind just ruminating, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. And it's like, instead of being like, I'm stupid, I can be like, well, that was a dumb move, Claire. Right?
Exactly.
Just organize. All right. So I screwed up there, and it's okay to screw up, and it doesn't make me a screw up, period. Right.
Right. So the last one is personalization. This is the blaming ourselves or taking responsibility for something that wasn't completely our fault, or blaming other people for something that wasn't completely their fault.
hmm
Um, a good example that I can think of is I know an officer that was running traffic, and within a couple minutes got a call for a rollover accident where somebody had died.
Hmm.
And the officer blamed himself for the death because he didn't traffic stop the individual.
Hmm.
Well, when I explored it with him, realized there was no probable cause for him to traffic stop the person. So he had no, he didn't cause it to happen, and there wasn't anything that he could legally do to intervene to
hmm
with that particular driver, because later on, then that's where their driving got erratic and they fell asleep at the wheel and there was an accident.
hmm
But he personalized it. It's my fault they died because I didn't stop them.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, it seems like, I mean, you're just taking on so much more power than you actually have in the world with this one, and so much more responsibility than is actually yours. And I can understand, right? Like, especially in law enforcement, they're helpers, like wanting to make the world better and stop bad things from happening. And we need all that. But they're not, we're not like gods or deities or anything that like has some all-knowing power where like, you could have predicted that if you didn't have the probable cause. There's no, way that you would even know to stop the vehicle or intervene. So
And sometimes we blame, an action that we do as a cause for somebody else's action. And
mhm.
that's simply not true. If I come to your house and you're making a beautiful meal, but I'm 15 minutes late and you burned the meal, it's not my fault you burned the meal. It's my fault I'm late, but it's your responsibility or role for allowing it to burn.
Yes, exactly.
So,
Thankfully, I didn't burn last night's dinner, but
so once we identify all these thinking errors,
yeah.
what do we do with them?
Mhm.
When you start seeing these in your life and you start seeing the patterns, give yourself a pat on the back, because noticing them is the first step. The second step is starting to figure out, am I believing that these true? If it is true, okay, now what's happening? Now,
Mhm.
sometimes we may not realize that until we start having an emotional reaction to something, or we start doing something that might say, oh my gosh, okay, I did it again. Wherever in the process you are, where you find it, give yourself credit for identifying the thinking error and the false belief so that you can correct it. And that's where the dispute comes in. I gave you an example of disputing earlier with the shoulds and musts,
Mhm.
um, and even a little bit with the labeling. But you can go back and dispute the automatic negative thought, because you can realize, oh, I'm making this bigger than it really is. That's disputing the thought.
Mhm.
Or I'm minimizing my positives. That's disputing the thought.
Mhm.
Sometimes you might have to fact check something. Is it true that this is going to happen?
Mhm.
I don't know. It may not.
Mhm.
Uh, Go
I
ahead.
think that my favorite like little example, I was training at like an elementary school, elementary middle combo one time, and we were talking about thinking distortions and the ABC model of thinking and emotions. And there was like the perfect example happening during our break. This little boy was hanging out with two friends, and they were all doing homework after school. And then those two friends were picked up by one of the parents of those kiddos, not siblings. And so those two friends left to have a play date. And this little boy that remained behind was just like in tears, breaking down, like he was little, right? And he was talking about how his friends don't like him and they're not really his friends and they're never going to hang out with him again. And, he's dumb and like all these different things. And, so he's assuming, right? His belief are so many cognitive thinking distortions. Like he's assuming, he is mind reading, he is predicting the future, they're never going to hang out with me again. I'm stupid, they don't like me. Like so many things are popping up for this little kiddo, that are cognitive thinking distortions, beliefs that are popping up for him. And he's having a very uncomfortable consequence, right, with this experience because of like everything that is popping up. And so if, we challenge that, or if he could have been in the space to challenge that, really the like thing to notice is all the thinking distortions, number one, and number two, to do that challenge, that dispute. Well, no, that those two already had a play date set up, and it was to help one of the other parents. The couples was, busy at work, and so this parent was taking the extra kid home with them to help with some daycare issues, and the little one that was left at school, the other two were just stoked to have extra time with him after school and to work on their homework together, right? And like that play date was already planned, and it had nothing to do with like or dislike of this little boy. And so I think, for folks to also keep in mind, like these cognitive thinking distortions pop up for us as adults, but you're also going to see them a ton in kids, especially like middle school kids, high school kids, where all of those like social dynamics are starting to be figured out and come into play. And so, this is a tool that is really good for adults, but also, think about like introducing it to your kids, or even if you don't introduce it like explicitly with them, to just help them with the pattern of like, oh, I can see you're thinking that, but what's another way we could think about this situation? Just to help them like start patterning that, like challenge those thinking distortions.
And because it's so hard sometimes for us to see it ourselves, having somebody outside of us helping us out can go a long way to improving our ability to self-detect. Um, that's where I'm going to lead to, my role and Chris Humphrey's role as mental health providers with the LeanWalk grant. Even in just a simple conversation over the phone, or if we're in the car with you or in the office, um, we can often detect these. Not that we call them out all the time, but if
Mhm,
you're like, I was thinking this might be a thinking error, Chris. Do you think this is true? And have a conversation.
mhm,
Because then we can walk you through um, some practice of how do you think better about it, or how do you think more rational about it.
mhm,
And the big goal is to reduce anxiety and depression when it's not necessary.
mhm. Oh, I love
Partic-
that. Yeah. And so I just popped up on the screen here real quick that Steve shared. We've got Chris Humphreys and Steve Bradley's cell numbers. So anyone in our LEMWA covered grant can reach out to them at any point in time. They're a free resource to our folks employed at our law enforcement agencies here in the Columbia River Gorge. So please reach out to them if you need help and support. And we're going to keep producing these monthly workshops for you all with Steve and Chris as our kind of main guest experts. And occasionally we might trickle in some new folks here and there. But Steve is always so grateful for your time, wisdom, expertise. And we'll see you back again soon for another session.
I have one last thing.
Oh, yeah.
Don't minimize your experience to think that it's unimportant or too small to call Chris or myself. I've seen that happen where somebody says, oh, it really wasn't a big deal, even though it bothered me. That's minimizing, because even though it's small, it can be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not the suffering Olympics. Okay. You don't have to have the gold medal to reach out to Steve or Chris. Right. Like you are all in the game. You all can reach out at any point in time, even if you haven't won the gold. So
Right.
awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you.